This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
All right, everybody, welcome into Season 4 of the Bartholomew Town Podcast. Bill Bartholomew here with you, as I'll be every Tuesday and Friday, wherever you're listening right now, and kicking off our 2021 campaign in style with the Boston Globe's Dan McGowan, and reading from the Monday, January 25th edition of Roadmap, that stands Rhode Island newsletter in the Boston Globe. An interesting conversation that's been going on for quite some time here in Rhode Island politics. The division of camps, the division of styles, backgrounds, and possibly strategies between Governor Raimondo, who obviously is Joe Biden's nominee for Commerce Secretary, and incoming Governor, Lieutenant Governor Dan McKee, no stranger to these airwaves here on BTOWN. He was the first guest ever on Bartholomew Town way back when in 2018. But this notion of different backgrounds, and this is something that we've talked about for a while now. You know, McKee, he's taking a sort of a home rule view to things and really took that mayor's standpoint, that mayoral viewpoint, into the office of lieutenant governor over the last 6 years. On the other hand, of course, Governor Raimondo, she comes from a financial background. Her network is global, and she relies heavily on outside consultants in an inner circle that, I mean, let's face it, more Eastside, Providence, Barrington than, say, Woonsocket, Central Falls. So this is interesting. From Roadmap on Monday the 25th, yesterday, if you're listening on release day, on the behind-the-scenes maneuvering side, it's no secret that Raimondo's administration has never treated McKee's office particularly well, and that's now playing out on a brighter stage. Raimondo's team is very east side of Providence, and McKee's team is very Blackstone Valley, and the two have fundamentally different approaches to just about everything. There's no obvious right or wrong, but here's a piece of advice for each side. Team Raimondo should probably stop sending snarky text messages to one another every time McKee does something, quote, GMR wouldn't do. And Team McKee should probably take a more nuanced approach to solving the state's most pressing problems than, quote, consultants bad, mayor's good. And that's from Dan McGowan's Roadmap here this week. And yeah, that is the question, the nuance that has been playing itself out over 2020, over the course of 2020. Dan McKee was iced out. Let's get it straight. Dan McKee was iced out of the conversation. He was not someone who appeared ever at the governor's weekly press conferences. He was somebody who was not included in that inner circle. I mean, we saw Director of Administration Brett Smiley on a regular basis, Commerce Corporation Secretary Stefan Pryor on a regular basis, right? We never saw Lieutenant Governor Dan McKee. And I was willing to bet at one point that if you polled the average person watching the governor's press conferences on a regular basis and you said, who is the lieutenant governor? They would have selected either Brett Smiley or Stefan Pryor as who they believed was lieutenant governor. So we have this divide. It's been there. They're trying to dress it up. They're trying to make it seem to the public at a certain level that this transition is going smoothly. But as Dan McGowan writes in the Boston Globe, literally he writes, the Raimondo to McKee transition isn't going very smoothly. So that's going to be part of the discussion that Dan and I have today as far as how does this all play out? You know, what does the future look like for Dan McKee as he enters a possible gubernatorial primary in 2022 with a long list of characters, some of whom are household names, others who are well-known in political circles, battling it out for a Democratic nomination to become governor for a proper term. So lots on the table today as we kick off season number 4, 2021. It's been an honor to serve you with this content, by the way. Subscribe, rate, and review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening right now. It does help the cause. And you can send me an email anytime, bill@ripodcast.com. And I make it a priority to get back to each and every one of you who reach out. So bill@ripodcast.com anytime you've got something to say that's on your mind. All right, so here we go. Kicking it off, season number 4, the 2021 season, that is the Boston Globe's Dan McGowan. Dan McGowan, ladies and gentlemen. Here we are, season 4. I feel like it was, I don't know, it just seems like so recent, the 2018 election, when you first came over to the loft and things, it doesn't seem like it was 3 years ago at this point. It's just been this weird time warp of obviously COVID, but just in general, I don't know, things seem to be moving quickly. They certainly have for you with everything that's developed at the Globe.
Well, 3 years has felt like 2 decades, to
Yeah.
be honest with you. If we're talking, I think both of us have aged a great deal, Bill.
Definitely.
It's funny. I mean, I feel like you're right. I can remember sitting down with you and having, I think our first podcast was like the longest one you ever did.
Yeah.
Forever. The number one thing right off the top we should say is congratulations to you and your success. I knew from the minute I first heard you that this was going to work out very well, but you have exploded in the last couple of years. And now I feel like, I hear your voice at these press conferences, and I immediately know it's Bill Bartholomew. It's very cool. It's a tribute to your hard work and the product you created. And I think you and I are very similar in that, we both really enjoy trying to be creative and innovative and think about new ways to present, information to the public. So congrats to you. It's been last time you and I talked, we were talking about the mayor's race in Providence, or the first time we were talking about the mayor's race in Providence, and suddenly we're going to have another one soon.
Yeah. Is D.D. Whitman going to be the next mayor of Providence? Right. I think was topic number 2 or something like that. No, I appreciate that a lot. And it's interesting here with Roadmap, which is the most read piece of content in Rhode Island for sure. And it's just become, it really quickly became something that I guess would be essential reading. And I'm pretty confident that it reaches way outside of the inside baseball of Rhode Island politics or Rhode Island news, that so many people are consuming it that's where they get their news. Literally, they don't listen to talk radio or anything else. That's just that quick 5-minute read every morning. And it's fascinating because we're in a time now where a commercial on YouTube is 5 seconds. A successful Instagram story campaign is 13, 14 seconds long. So to have these short bites that you're able to put together every morning, it feeds into the contemporary way that people are consuming content, but it also doesn't feel like you're getting cheated. And you found a way to, I guess, get this micro newspaper to people every day. What's that been like, and how do you do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I like that sort of concept of a micro newspaper. I think coming into the Globe, when we started having these discussions really roughly this time 2 years ago, right? I started at the Globe in April, and we started having kind of discussions in December and January before that. What I said to the Globe was, hey, you're coming to, you're exploring this idea in Rhode Island. I'm not sure that, I have every good idea, but I can tell you 2 things that I think would make us stand out right away. And one is a daily curated newsletter, a la Political Playbook, some of the stuff that Axios does. And I said, it's because nobody else does it right now, right? And look, newsletters were not created by me, and they were successful pieces of content and successful business model behind them long before, the Globe ever did this. But it was a hole in the market. There was a way to really hit people, again, early in the morning. And, what I pushed really hard was it has to be every day, has to be out before 8 a.m., has to be informative to your point, to the insiders, but also something that is accessible to the average person. And I'll go back to that in a second. The other thing that I suggested, which we had some initial success on pre-COVID, was live events. Same thing, there's a unfortunate, I think, situation that we have in news in general where, it can feel very sort of old and stodgy, right? It's the newspaper every day, or it's the, doing the same thing on the 6 o'clock news every day or on talk radio. And I said, we can have events, we can put, drinks in people's hands and have them listen to interesting people talk. And 1, you can make money off of it, but 2, you become this brand that people are comfortable with. Oh, are you going to the Globe thing tonight? That was what I wanted people to say. I think we were on that path before COVID hit. And, we're going to really try to lean into that in 2021. And, I think start by doing a few digital or virtual events. And hopefully by the end of the year, start talking about doing live stuff again, because I think it's really important. You caught on to something really important. I'm not afraid to say this, the Globe, our newsletter roadmap every day has a subscriber list of just over 50,000 people now.
Yeah.
And, an open rate that approaches 30 and 40% every day. So you're talking thousands and thousands of people every single day who are, at least opening it, if not, digesting the entire thing. And one of the things that it's been a real challenge to me, but I've loved, is that the combination of needing to bring things down to something relatively small, right? I'm not trying to I don't want you to be drinking your coffee or ordering your coffee in the morning and get caught up on a paragraph that you don't understand, right? I want you to be able to really quickly understand it. But I also, I'm somebody who historically, right, I was a city hall reporter. I cater to a very small crowd of real insiders. The bubble, the lobbyists and the politicians and the people who want to be politicians, right? That sort of crowd. And this has been a real experiment to still be obsessed with being competitive and wanting to have, big scoops and big news, but also wanting to be kind of accessible to, the average person in Westerly, right? And that means sometimes, it means the story selection is really important. It means, doing kind of cute things like on Fridays of, just telling people happy birthday and getting people to send in whose birthday is coming up. Those are things that aren't of any particularly news value, but people really like it. And I think that's been a sign of our success, and it's why we're growing a little bit.
Yeah, it's community building, and that's a role that is shared by different institutions. But some would argue that the news media, which is, again, that's a terrible broad stroke to describe news and really information distribution. But some would say that the media has served less as that community anchor in recent times. It's become so narrow-casted or based on shock value and so forth that, I think back to Channel 10, they used to do a similar thing with first birthdays, and Art Lake, the weatherman, would come out, and just that interactive element where you're telling the story of the community on a daily basis. News still does that for sure, but it's lost a little bit of the soft touch that I think something like your birthday announcements bring to the table, side by side with a review of the Nerona Jeff Britt situation or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, the thing is that by being good sort of community partners, by being a trusted brand, whether it's the Globe or the Providence Journal or any certainly of the major news outlets here, be doing those things, the little things, getting the little things right. I think it enhances your brand, and it makes you even more kind of trusted in those things. And these are little things that don't take a lot of, resources, right? Like it doesn't take a lot to have me ask for your birthday, or for, some of my most successful newsletters in terms of the engagement and the open rates are, when I ask for people to send in their, what are they looking forward to in 2021 or things like that. And you get hundreds and hundreds of replies, and, people feel good about, oh, you're listening. I maintain, this has been a policy of mine forever, is I respond to every single email that I get or call or anything like that. And it's because, sometimes just simply having a conversation with somebody can, it can disarm people if they're very angry, but it can also make people feel like they're being heard. And so all the little things add up to, I think, that trust and all that we want to do, again, at the Globe, but also broadly, I think, in the market.
What do you think about the idea now that maybe it was a Trump era thing, but just the general public's position that the media is by and large feeding fake news or is an institution to not be trusted and to ridicule at some level, not scrutinize. That's different. I mean, certainly scrutiny is important and acceptable, and you can read coverage of a particular story in the Globe, the Pro Joe, on any of the TV stations, and hear one of the talk hosts on either radio or podcast provide analysis on it and disagree with any number of them. But the notion that the media here in Rhode Island, we hear it, is somehow an enemy of, I don't know, the people or whatever it is. Do you think that we're in a better place now? Is it cooling off, that sort of rhetoric? I
don't think it's cooling off. And I think it's actually going to potentially get worse. And here's why. Look, there's always been the element of the what we call like the troll who just bashes you, on Facebook or on Twitter and a caller into talk radio or something like that. And, it's always been something, or by the way, emailers and stuff like that. Like, and it's always been something that you kind of, if you have a good sense of humor, you can laugh it off. I always joke with my former colleagues at Channel 12. Some of my closest friends are, the weather people. And if you get a real bad weather prediction, the emails that flow in are nasty and often hilarious, right? Yeah. And everybody can kind of get the joke. It became a lot more hostile in the last 4 years. As lines in the sand were really drawn, you either were all in on President Trump or you were, absolutely positively, disgusted by him, and you couldn't support one position and not support another. And it was very yes or no or right or left and things like that. The reason I think it could get worse is that, there were a lot of folks, right? A lot of folks subscribed to the Globe and to certainly the bigger papers like the Times and the Post. And they thought, boy, they're really doing their job. They're holding the president accountable. Never been such a, great time to be a journalist, right? Covering the president. And then there was, a whole half of the country that were like, everything they report is fake and not true. And they're just bashing the president. And now you've got a situation where you have a Democratic president. And I think, you and I are recording this only a couple of days after the president was inaugurated, but, and there's been, I think, a lot of, early coverage that is, probably a little bit overly praising, and everything is how this president is different, how this vice president is different. But look, things are going to change because the reporters covering the White House are going to uncover things. There's going to be scandal in the Democrats' administration just as much as maybe not just as much as President Trump, but there are things that happen, right? This is how it works. And I think the left is going to have, suddenly this situation where they're going to say, wait a minute, why? And not everybody, but there's going to be this look of, why are they going after him? And people have short memories. It's going to be, you didn't treat President Trump like this, when it's like, of course we did, right? We held him accountable, and President Biden should be held accountable. And by the way, in the last 4 years, a lot of Trump supporters said, well, Barack Obama was never treated like this. And there are plenty of reporters who would say Barack Obama was actually pretty awful to the press. And there's some evidence that would suggest that was true. So I think these things go in waves. The problem is because we went in this, this so far line in the sand with the last president. I think you now have a situation where the left is going to be pretty upset with the way the media covers Joe Biden. They're also going to be really upset with the way Joe Biden governs because, right, he's a moderate, he's a deal maker, he's, somebody who is probably not going to be overly woke or certainly overly left. And so they're going to be confused about how the media is covering things. They're going to be confused about how the president is governing. So I think it's actually going to get more hostile. I hate to say that. I don't know that we'll feel and I don't know about you, Bill. I very rarely had any situations where I felt particularly unsafe. I think some of my female colleagues, particularly in TV, have had really awful things happen in the last couple of years. I think that it might not be as bad, overtly, but I do think there's going to be still a lot of people really digging in.
Yeah, and it's not that foreign for us here in Rhode Island with Governor Raimondo, outgoing Governor Raimondo, where there was so much criticism of her on the right on a regular basis, and then there was so much criticism on the left, and she clearly deflected, and the thing that she disliked the most was when a Steve Alquist or an activist group or whatever would call her out from the left. And I feel like Joe Biden fits that narrative pretty much in the same way, where he's clearly a moderate Democrat. Some positions he leans conservative Democrat, and I guess he can sort of play into the progressive Democratic angles to an extent, but it's almost like when you walk that line, nobody's happy. There's only a small select group of people that will say, yeah, that's my guy. That's my person. That person speaks for my values in a greater than 75% capacity.
Yeah. I mean, and by the way, Gina Raimondo is such a good example, because I think the thing that frustrates the governor, and more so her either staff or most loyal supporters, is the way they look at this is the majority of people were with us, right? They say, like, we won by, we won with challenges from the left in a primary in 2014. We overwhelmingly won re-election in 2018. And yet, nothing is ever sort of good enough. I think that's their view from the left. Now, by the way, the left has a legitimate critique of her. The governor is not a hard left Democrat, right? And this is where to the other end, people who thought she was a socialist on the right were crazy. I mean, that was completely wrong. The truth is, she's a pro-business, pretty moderate Democrat. That's why she's going to be the Commerce Secretary. And she was more interested in getting sort of her agenda done, getting things done. She was far less, willing to kind of take big stands on things that for good reason, lots of people feel very strongly about. Police reform, you didn't hear very much from her about. Certainly some of the women's issues, she was not outspoken in the way that maybe some folks wanted her to be. What she would say was, I was trying to, accomplish a lot behind the scenes. And, we're going to be debating her record for a long time. I think she has a pretty good one overall. And I think she will be remembered, certainly because of COVID, as just, a really fascinating governor. But, it is just not as simple as she's, so far to the right or she's so far to the left. And you're right. Joe Biden's going to be very similar. Don't forget, Joe Biden in the Senate, really spent much of his career trying to be the middle person, right? And the trying to be the person that could walk across the aisle, that was never really first on a lot of, anything from civil rights to the environment, anything else, wanted to build consensus and moved as the room moved, so to speak, but was never really the leader, the out front, the AOC type. And so it'll be interesting to see how he does, because I don't think he's going to change at 78 years old.
Yeah, highly unlikely. I take you inside breaking news and the biggest stories of the day impacting Rhode Island on Instagram at Bartholomew Town, Twitter at Bill Bartholomew, and inside the Bartholomew Town podcast Facebook group. You had a really smart story yesterday interviewing two former Commerce secretaries. It seems like this is the perfect role based on experience, resume, destiny, if you will, for Gina Raimondo. And if there were a role that made sense for her to walk away from her governorship in the middle of her second term and stay in the public spotlight in a way that she can really have a firm grasp on certain elements of her background, particularly her contacts within big industry. Is this perfect Gina Raimondo territory?
I think so too. I mean, I did a story over the summer, actually, classic story that all of us did, but what's her potential landing spot if Joe Biden wins? And, I ranked it as, and it was one of those things that I didn't put it in a ranking, but if you looked at the list, you'd say oh, this is what Dan believes.
Yeah.
And I think my top three were stays put, Treasury Secretary, Commerce Secretary. And, I did think for a long time that if she didn't get a major job, she would stay. And I still think that is true. I think Treasury, for a lot of reasons, was the thing she wanted. It would have been a glass ceiling thing. Of course, Janet Yellen's going to do the same thing, first female Treasury Secretary. But Commerce always seemed to make a lot of sense. I had a conversation, not to name drop, but over the summer with David Axelrod, Obama's former guy. He agreed that he thought Commerce was kind of an intelligent landing spot for her. And you talk to, these former Commerce secretaries. I talked to Penny Pritzker and Gary Locke, both who worked in the Obama administration. Locke was a former governor of Washington. And he made the case, like, this job is perfect for governors. Like, governors have to deal with a whole lot. It's a lot like being the mayor of a major city. Like, you just get a lot thrown at you. And remember, the Commerce is everything. It ranges from, economic development stuff to, the fisheries and, the patent office. And, it's a very wide ranging thing. And then Penny Pritzker, who is very close to Gina Raimondo. In fact, she was the person who was behind the scenes, I think her biggest advocate in the Biden camp to be joining as Commerce Secretary, and has just been a friend for several years. She sees this job, especially at this moment in time, as incredibly vital. Sometimes you do it's not like we can rattle off. I had to Google former Commerce Secretaries.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Can't rattle them off. But in this moment where you're going to have, another massive stimulus, you have an economic recovery that's going to be really complicated, because a lot of these jobs that, some of the first ones to go are ones that may never come back, right? The way retail is changing, things like that. And Governor Raimondo, for all the big things that she was a part of in the last 6 years, people miss that, there are little things that didn't deserve to be front page or A block news, but, her investments in job training and, this idea of reskilling workers is going to be, really her true legacy here, I think, in a lot of ways. And that all that stuff is now going to play out on the national level. It's going to be this discussion about how do you get a person who is, 50 years old, has a lot of life to live and a lot of work years ahead of them. How do you get them from being able to, work at Macy's to now doing something else that's going to put money on the table for 20, 30 years potentially. The governor cares deeply about that stuff. She's far more interested in private conversations that I've had with her over the years. She's far more interested in talking about that stuff than she is about talking about national politics or what's going on in the General Assembly. And so I think she is well equipped. And it seems like a lot of former Commerce secretaries. I was trying, Bill, to get Wilbur Ross, the outgoing Commerce Secretary.
Yes.
I thought that would have been really fun. Just to get his perspective on what the job was like, but they declined to talk to me.
What a shame.
Not a surprise, but what a shame.
Yeah, a governor is a manager, and when names come up for 2022, and certainly Dan McKee will have an extreme advantage, no doubt about it. But whenever names come up, it's always interesting to me how people overlook the most important quality of a governor, which is that ability to manage. And it's less of an ideological position than, say, Speaker of the House or any member of the General Assembly. And people forget that. And that for all of her criticisms, and there are plenty of them that have been lobbed during COVID, whether you're coming from the perspective of small businesses that haven't been able to stay afloat as a result of her policies, or the perspective of, hey, restaurants in Twin River are open when we're seeing massive spikes in COVID numbers, and that's putting people who work in those particular jobs at risk. Either direction warranted criticism, but at the end of the day, it's that ability to balance. It's like a baseball manager. It's the ability to find the lineup card, know when to pinch hit, et cetera, et cetera. And that's something that as we look for the next governor, I think Dan McKee, from his mayoral experience, from his time carving out a role in the lieutenant governor spot, he has that. And I wonder if the other challengers in the potential gubernatorial field, particularly on the Democratic side, obviously they have some of that, but have they been tested in a way that would prove that they are a statewide executive level manager that should be entrusted with overseeing the moving parts of the state?
Yeah, I mean, well, look, being an effective manager is thoroughly unsexy, right? It's hard to manage. It's hard to, put a campaign slogan around that and things like that. So that's why you don't see it as, you don't see candidates really tout themselves in that way very often. Even when the governor was running for re-election a couple of years ago, it's not like she said, let's keep going. That was kind of her way of doing it. But it's not like she, overly played her hand on how good she was doing, right? There is something to be said. You just brought up the great debate of what, like, every day. I mean, you were live at every one of her press conferences. You covered this. She would always say, there's no easy decision here. I never make everybody happy, no matter what it is. And all that can be happy talk, but it was very much true. What stood out about her and what is important, I think, and when you start to think about the next governor, is the ability to just make a decision, right? Being decisive. Sometimes the best decision is just a decision itself, right?
Right.
And you get a lot of people who, they get the spotlight on them and they want to create a committee for everything. And they want to, hear from 15 different, people, and the last person they talk to is the one where they go with the decision, or they're like unusually influenced by a lobbyist or whatever else. I mean, the governor, to her credit, was decisive. She took action. She was always, said this the whole way, whether it's her position on keeping schools open and then reopening them, or her kind of the way she structured reopening the economy. She certainly took a more conservative approach. There were a lot of times where she sounded a lot like President Trump about wanting things to reopen, because she had this idea in her head that if the economy continues to tank, it will be way worse, right? Whether or not she was right or not, that was her view of the world. I think Dan McKee coming in very similarly. Dan McKee is a decision maker. He did it for years as the Cumberland mayor. I think to go into 2022, certainly the whole chessboard has changed. I think Dan McKee would go from being an unlikely favorite or an unlikely future governor to now the favorite, probably narrowly. Not, it's not like he's definitely going to win, but he certainly is going to have 2 years to prove himself. And what he's going to do over the next 2 years is try to come across as somebody who the average Rhode Islander can trust. And he's going to have a lot of help, right? Think about it. You're going to have a ton of federal money, certainly for the next 2 years, with a Democratic House and Senate and a Democratic president. You're going to get to spend a lot of time reopening things, a lot of time, ribbon cutting. And he spent a lot of time before this. It wasn't just, now it will be politically beneficial. But as you know, Dan McKee spent the last several years focusing pretty hard on what small businesses need. And so, he kind of does walk the walk. And as you look at the rest of these candidates, on one hand, you've got Seth Magaziner, who I think we would have all agreed would have probably before been the narrow favorite. He certainly can raise money. He's got a big name. He's going to have union support. He still is going to be a major player, but now he is, 2 years from now, he will be running against the incumbent, right? And so, his challenge is going to be, you can't just be the younger version of Dan McKee, right? That's not sexy enough to get elected. And so he's going to have to thread this needle of, how do you criticize the incumbent governor in a moment of crisis without being overly critical? And how do you separate yourself in many ways? And then you look at the other people, Nellie Gorbea. I still think she has a real chance. She seems to really want to run, even though I think there are some people who think she'd be a great lieutenant governor, and that would be an interesting kind of debate. She's going to raise money, but she's going to struggle with name recognition. Secretary of State is not a household name. I think Mayor Elorza is interesting because, on one hand, he's all over the place politically, supports charter schools, which the left hates him for, but then is like, let's do reparations and let's do universal income and all these other things. So he's got to figure out sort of his message, but talk about a guy, he's an executive, he makes decisions. And I think that will be interesting. If I were him, right, if I were running against a fairly moderate Democratic incumbent, maybe he fills the role of the Matt Brown from a couple of years ago, where he just goes super hard to the left and tries to pick up, maybe he's a better candidate. He certainly will be potentially better funded, things like that. And maybe he separates himself and offers the contrast. But for a lot of these guys and women who are kind of, don't always know where they stand on everything and who are kind of middle of the road people, Dan McKee just grabbed a whole bunch of the middle piece of the cake,
Yeah, he really did. And I think the game changer will be, is it Nellie Gorbea, is it Seth Magaziner, or is it Jorge Elorza who gets the support that Matt Brown, Aaron Regenberg, and other statewide progressive candidates had? Whether that's some kind of an alliance or whether or not that's an actual endorsement by, I'm not sure the political cooperative necessarily has the teeth to elect a governor on a statewide basis, but they may get to a point where, in concert with other organizations and strong backers and tastemakers, you could build a progressive candidate out of a Gorbea or an Elorza that satisfies that rubric. And based on who the Republicans are looking down the line, if you're looking at a Blake Filippi or an Alan Fung, some people might say, hey, the better matchup would be an Elorza or Gorbea against a Fung or Filippi. Yeah. That might be a truer representation of the population. Then again, I think that there are a lot of Rhode Islanders who are satisfied with someone like a Dan McKee holding his first press conference at Cello's, small business owner, the small town, a lot of home rule tendencies, and just an ability to communicate in a way that doesn't sound, it's not that it doesn't sound scripted, because oftentimes you can tell he's literally reading a script from either a teleprompter or, one of his staffers holding up a cue card, but it sounds like you're talking to somebody that maybe shows up at your Thanksgiving, some uncle or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, look, Dan comes across as a regular guy. And I've known Dan McKee for, a decade now, and he's always been like that, and he's always won. People miss this. You don't like Dan McKee because he supports charter schools. You don't like Dan McKee because, made a bad decision here or there in Cumberland, or, wasn't always the flavor of the month when it comes to like organized labor or, whatever the issue was. All Dan McKee does is win, right? He's withstood challenges both years, both terms as lieutenant governor. So I think he has a lot to build on. And I think it is a little bit of, he does come across as that sort of regular guy. By the way, thoroughly competent, has a, master's degree from Harvard. It's not like we're talking about, Joe Schmo here. He's certainly, he knows what he's doing, and he knows that's part of his, his image. I'm interested in this. If you think back in history, and it's hard to completely look right at the past in Rhode Island, but if you think about it, Rhode Island hasn't had an extremely liberal Democratic nominee for governor in 22. It'll be 20 years.
Murph York. Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Because you go. Charlie Fogarty was not. Frank Caprio was, practically a Republican. Of course, there was Link Chafee in that race, but Frank Caprio was the Democratic nominee. Gina Raimondo twice. So, and by the way, the last time that Murph York was in that race, she lost to a relatively conservative businessman, Don Kachiri. I do think the the way the politics seem to shake out here in Rhode Island right now are such that if I were a Democrat, I would be worried way more about how I can sneak through a primary. And it does feel like a moment right now in the country and in the region where, if the Republicans if Blake Filippi turns into a fantastic candidate, or if third time's a charm for Alan Fung, and you say, you know what, turns out like he left Cranston in really great shape. He was an excellent mayor. I want to give him a chance now. You almost roll the dice if you're the Democrat. I think you do, and this brings to the point you brought up, like the political co-op or these other groups. Like, I would be taking them very seriously right now, because if they can help me get through a primary, I would think that I don't care who the Democratic nominee for governor is for 2 years from now. Literally, you could make it be Aaron Regenberg. You could make it be, whoever the most far left person in the state. They're at worst a coin flip from being governor, right? It's not like they're going to get beat 70-30 by whoever is on the other side. And so all these, I think there's a ton of value in some of these groups that have emerged that have been really successful. They picked their spots, better than many of us, myself included, gave them credit for. And so, I would not be dismissive of them. At the same time, Gina Raimondo can show you that you don't need the far left to win. And so if you're Dan McKee, you probably feel like you've got a good case to make too.
Yeah, it's really going to be interesting. We've been looking forward to it since 2018 on election night, basically. But all right, last question. The Globe's expanding in Rhode Island. That's a great thing for everybody, because more news is a great thing. There's a lot more independent, I don't know if a lot more, but there's some more independent people, podcasters, freelancers that are sort of getting on Twitter. We're starting to see that activity. Obviously, hopefully Rhode Island PBS continues to expand and have an additional presence beyond Lively Experiment and the new weekly show that I'm a part of, full disclosure. But are we in a healthier place than ever before? Not ever before, but in recent times, with respect to local media and the ability for stories that are as nuanced as a random road in Tiverton and a random stretch of highway in Hopkinton being as well covered as the General Assembly or the governor's press conference?
Well, I was going to say that I'm totally bullish on where we are in the media landscape right now in Rhode Island. To answer specifically that question of am I confident that the very hyper local news is going to get covered? That's a little bit more difficult to say. I think the Valley Breeze does a fantastic job. I think there's plenty of local, Warwick Beacon, the Cranston Herald still punch above their weight. So there's still a chance for those important stories locally to get covered. But let's not pretend like every city and town council or zoning board is getting covered. There are things that slip through the cracks because there aren't, the journal bureaus like there were many years ago and things like that. So, on that, do I think that there's enough, if you combine sort of like the crowdsourcing that can happen. So, there's a controversial thing happening in Tiverton, and, if there's enough, whether they're activists or just people who are concerned citizens who can get, the attention of, let's say, Ted Nesi or whatever, and Ted takes an interest in the story and goes and covers it. I think there's a chance that the big issues will get covered. I'm not totally convinced that every facet of everything gets covered. And I think that's the same for, even the bigger city, even like Providence City Hall. I worry about the sort of the void there, though my former colleague, Steph Machado, I think does just a spectacular job, and she's really, really doing good work there. But so I think that's a problem. More broadly, there's this concept, Bill, of in the media, like in inside circles, that people talk a lot about this idea of news deserts. And it's the concept of like somewhere there are parts of this country where you do not have a local news outlet to get your news from, literally meaning like within maybe a couple hundred miles potentially. Yeah. That's not the case in Rhode Island. We happen to benefit from being really small, but you have 3 robust TV stations. You've got the radio. You've got, you now have 2 major newspapers, the Journal and the Globe, the local Pravs of the world. Then there's like the work that you're doing, which you've built this big following. So, I think we're in a really healthy place overall on that front. But could it always be better? Yeah. For me, from what the Globe is trying to do, one of the things I'm really excited about. So we are expanding, as you said. We've already hired a young woman from the Providence Business News, Alexa Gagas. We'll have some more announcements very soon, the next month or two. What's really cool about this is what this shows you is, look, the Globe would not be doing this, would not be adding several $100,000 in overhead with more staffers if the experiment that we started 2 years ago wasn't working, right? If we weren't making money for the Globe, we would not be announcing expansion. And, there was a couple of years ago, people said, well, if you only have 1 or 2 or 3 reporters, do you really think you're going to break through? Why didn't you maybe really go at it to compete with the Journal and have 10 people? Well, if we had hired 10 people 2 years ago, given the year that we just had, economically, broadly in the media because of the pandemic, you and I right now would be talking about, how we're still committed to Rhode Island, but we slashed half our staff.
Right.
And so, I think it's a really good sign that we are growing, and it's because financially it has worked. And so I'm really excited about that. I hope that it can work. I hope that next year you and I are having another conversation where we're adding even more people and doing more creative things. So I feel pretty good about it. I'm worried about the Providence Journal like everybody else. First of all, I have friends over there, but I really think they're still the daily paper of record, and we need them to succeed. They've got a new editor coming in. I'm rooting for them, and I think everybody should be. But I do think overall the news business is in a really good place. What you're doing at PBS Weekly, right? That's brand new. My former station, Channel 12, is really, really invested. Channel 10 is still a heavyweight. So there's a lot of really good stuff happening in this market. We're fortunate. I mean, I don't think that there's another metro market the size of ours that has this much news coming out of it, and this much media, so to speak. So it's a good sign.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's a really exciting time for Rhode Island media going into this year. And I think 2020 was a good experiment in how well can information be disseminated into a large group of people and sort of serve that traditional role of information bearer that news media provides, but then also providing a detailed and varying analysis. And it'll be exciting to see where it goes from here. I'm certainly a huge fan of the Globe and also the Projo. I mean, like you said, it's not one or the other. I mean, this dichotomy of, do you like this? Do you like this host on PRO or that one? Or do you like this newspaper or that one? Or do you like 10 or 12? And it's kind of like, I like whatever's happening in the moment. And
I like interesting.
Interesting. Yeah, exactly. Dan McGowan, ladies and gentlemen, the Boston Globe, Rhode Island. It is immediately following this interview. If you haven't already subscribed to Roadmap, every morning you'll be greeted with what you need to know for the day, and it's essential reading, and it's really the taste making apparatus between, well, usually by 7 a.m. and
usually
whenever you wake up.
This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.